Alright, these are your online note number 6. We're getting to the end of Unit 2. So let's go ahead and go over the main words. So we're going to be focusing on the Second Great Awakening and kind of the impacts it has on religion, public schools, and asylum and prison reforms. Dorothea Dix's kind of part in that asylum and prison reform, the temperance movement, the Seneca Falls Convention, and then Sojourner Truth. So we'll go ahead and start with the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is kind of this impulse towards reform, and it's rooted in all of these revivals. And so this picture kind of shows a revival going on. And so religions start to promote the idea of individualism and that every person is responsible for themselves, and that the individual, since they are responsible, they are the ones who should take control for seeking salvation rather than having this predetermined fate of you're going to heaven and you're going to hell, which is what everybody else had this idea of before. But one of the major impacts of this whole idea of individualism and responsibility and the whole movement in religion is its impact on enslaved African Americans. So you've got several new churches that believe all people belong to the same God, and therefore everybody is equal. So no matter if you're black or white, you are all equal. And so many slaves hear this message and they think, oh, well, these people are fighting for our freedom. And in a way that they are, but because of the Second Great Awakening, you have more of the American people seeing that these Africans should not maybe necessarily be slaves anymore, that maybe they aren't really different. Also, as a result of these ideas of religion, you get these new communities that are being built, kind of utopian communities where everything just works out perfectly. But they are very much experimental communities and groups, and these communities all vary in their philosophies and their living arrangements, and none of them really are very, very successful. So, moving on to schools in the 1840s, 1850s. So, before the mid-1800s, there is no unified educational policy. Classrooms are not divided by age, and many children do not complete or finish school past the age of 10. So, you have a lot of the schoolhouses where you have K through 12, if anybody even makes it to the 12th grade. And there's one teacher teaching kids from 5 to however old that school may have. Like I said, most students don't make it past the age of 10. Now, those that do are normally the fairly wealthy who they're paying for their children to go to private schools. So these are more of our public schools, are the one school building with all the grades in it. But by the 1830s, Americans began to push and even demand for a tax on public schools. So that way there's some funding. By 1850, every state has provided some form of publicly funded elementary school. Now, those who are sending their children to private school, they kind of throw a fit about having to pay taxes for these public schools that their children are not going to because they don't think they're good enough. But most of the states in New England do make it a requirement anyways that some of the taxes go to the public schools. So, like I said, by 1850, you pretty much have every elementary school that has some type of state funds. But it did take many years for the public schools to firmly establish themselves in the South and the West. This is mostly because the children were needed in the farms and the day-to-day chores to get things done, that they pulled them out of school at a very early age. Also at this time, people are starting to look at asylums and prisons, and they see that maybe the prisons are rigged and overly severe, and this is kind of brought up by a French citizen who comes to America and notices how rigid and severe our American prisons are, and asylums. So Dorothea Dix kind of steps up. She is horrified when she discovers that the jails are often housing mentally ill patients or people with those who have committed very severe crimes, and so she persuades 9 southern states to set up a public hospital specifically for the mental ill. So now they're taking the mentally ill out of prisons and putting them in asylums or mentally ill hospitals. She emphasizes the idea of rehabilitation rather than they're completely doomed, they can never change. And so after this, not only does she see rehabilitation for the mentally ill, but also for those in prison, and this is what we need to do so that way when their time is up they go back into society and just do not, keep making the same mistakes over and over again. They learn from their mistakes, they move on, they are decent citizens now. And so she's the first one that really starts pushing for that. Alright, women reform. So we've already kind of talked about it, but just as a quick review, women's roles in the 1800s are pretty much housework and childcare. And that is just what they were expected to do. But some women start working for temperance. Now, the temperance movement is an effort to prohibit the drinking of alcohol. And so here's a poster, help me keep him pure, please vote against the sale of liquors. They have found that the men, more specifically the men, are abusing the liquor and not maybe going to work and can't support their families. And women really can't at this time support their families because it's not socially accepted for a woman to work all the time. And so the women think the best thing to do is to just stop the sale of liquor. So many Americans recognize the drunkenness as a serious problem in America. Besides just the women, so you do have several men who are also fighting for this temperance movement. A little bit more on women reform is the education. So new opportunities do arise for women during this time, and many start to go to school past the elementary level, which is a big step. And then we'll move on to Seneca Falls, so where the star, is where Seneca Falls is in New York. And it's in 1848, and so nearly 300 women and men gather at Seneca Falls, and they discuss women's rights, and they focus on the temperance movement. As you can see, the women here, votes for women. They want the right to vote. But even at the convention itself, there is this huge disagreement on, well, should women really have the right to vote? Some women don't feel like they should have the right to vote, and other women feel that they do. And men are torn both ways also. But it is a really good step towards women's rights and fighting for them. And then finally, Sojourner Truth. She is or was a slave, and so the conditions for slaves start to worsen in the mid-1800s. And so she travels through the country arguing for abolition and the right for slaves to be free. She does this with a lot of the women who are fighting for temperance and just women's rights, and a lot of those religious groups from the Second Great Awakening that they no longer see African Americans as these people who should be slaves. So you can see that there's a lot of reform going on in the United States right before the Civil War and in the mid-1800s. So we have our country, we've kind of set some guidelines, and now we're going, everything's not working quite how we want it to, so let's start to reform it. And so we will think that's pretty much it. Alright.